This show really targets remote workers who are in the health and education business. And when you're in remote work, it's really hard to kind of put your work down. And then you don't have the decency of a commute. So I really wanted to create like bite-sized mental models and mental frameworks to help someone get out of a funk.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
What's up, podcaster? It's your host, Adam Adams. And today we are joined again about 340 episodes later, back in episode 68. And I'll make sure that episode 68 is in the show notes because you're going to probably want to check it out, especially after listening to this episode. So we got Helen Garcia, who's one of my favorite people in the world. And she had a different podcast back in episode 68. And she started a newer podcast recently called Conscious Minimalism. So we're going to talk to her about why did she end the podcast and start another one? Was it difficult? Was it easy? What did she think about? Did she work with a consultant? What's the purpose of doing it? So we're going to find some of that out. And you're also going to want to learn how to get your unique identity out of your podcast. How do you do that? Well, you find episode 68 because Helen helped us there. Helen, you started a new podcast called Conscious Minimalism.
I did.
How long has this one been going?
I launched that one in late August, early September.
Okay, so as we're recording, it's been a couple months.
Yep, 3 months. Yep,
cool.
Pretty new.
And you told me in the green room, and I felt bad because I was like, the listener needs to hear this. So what was going on with the other podcast? Are you still producing it? Is it still up? Why did you leave it? Why did you add another one? What's going on there?
Yeah, so I created Who You Needed when I was 19, 20, and I was still in grad school, like late college. And I felt like I didn't have any direction for the podcast. I was making decent money from it, but I didn't have a clear direction. And the podcast Who You Needed just didn't really have a clear ideology and didn't have a clear message. So that's why I ended it. And then
when you say ended, for the listener, what do you really mean?
I stopped making new episodes, but you can still find Who You Needed on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, wherever you listen, iHeartRadio, Pandora.
Cool. Before we go too far, you said that you made money with that podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've had a couple of episodes on this podcast, the podcast on podcasting. I've had a few that were about how do you make money? How do you make money through a podcast? And we talk about 8 different ways to make money through a podcast, 3 top ones. But I'm curious how you were monetizing that show first and foremost. Like you started when you were 19 or 20, you were in grad school, somehow it was making money. How did you do that?
Yeah. So back then, it's actually how we met through Clubhouse. I would talk about my podcast, and then different people in the voiceover community would ask me to do like host read ads for them. So that's how I ended up making money from Who You Needed. But I think that's why I shifted into this podcast, because I felt like I was making side money from just meeting different people and networking with different people, but it wasn't specifically out of that show. And then I started doing like meditation stuff for people, workshops, speaking gigs for them based on mental health and workshopping with different people, coaching. So that's how I made money from Who You Needed.
Okay. So I think that the listener might get some value out of just dissecting it a little bit, because it's sounding like you definitely made money through the podcast in multiple ways. And it's also sounding like something's reminding me of this one book, which I never liked Grant Cardone. I'll just be honest. I never liked him. I never was excited about his content. I think he's kind of pushy or whatever. Yeah. So I just never resonated, but somebody told me, multiple people on my old podcast said I need to read 10X Rule. And so I ended up doing that. And the premise of 10X, or what I got out of it, was that you really ought to be doing all of the things at the same time. Like what I mean is you need to be advertising this and that and doing this and that, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And for him, he basically made a ton of money because he did that. And I'm looking at what you're doing with your podcast, and I'm thinking it might be the same. So I'm wanting you to kind of fill in some of the gaps. It sounds like you definitely did make money through the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, it seems like you were doing you were in other places and kind of letting things mesh together, kind of like what they were doing in 10X. So could you share that strategy, whether it was a purposeful strategy or just happened with the listener?
Yeah. So what podcasting allows even a young person to do, or what it allowed me to do at 19, 20, is it allowed me to meet people that I wouldn't have otherwise met if I didn't start podcasting. So when you start a podcast, you get to meet and network with different people every single week. You get to I got invited to mental health conferences and I got invited to speak on stages. And so it provided me the opportunity to network with maybe 3 or 4 people every single day. And when you multiply 365 days out of the year times 3, that's about 1,000 new people that you meet every single day. At least 1 to 10 people want to pay for your services or pay for the knowledge that you have. And so at the time, the way that I started to learn was going to grad school, taking what I learned in grad school with the communication principles and mental health. I applied those negotiation and conversation skills with the people that I met through Clubhouse, through LinkedIn, through Instagram. And some people were like, you know what, Helen, your voice is really soothing. And you do this meditation voiceover for my show. I was like, okay, sure. And then that person knew another person who recommended me. And then I ended up getting mentorship, sometimes for free, sometimes paid. And those people referred me as a coach to high school students. And then I ended up getting paid maybe $3 or $4 grand per 8-week session with coaching other students and helping them through their careers. And so I think in total, from Who You Needed alone, I made probably about $4,000 to $5,000 ? But it was a decent thing to do as a grad student. So it gave me cash for gas and stuff.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So there's a lot of ancillary benefits to being a thought leader. Having the podcast, getting to know people, having new conversations, networking, being the person that you're the squeaky wheel that people are thinking about. So you get the grease. So they're like, oh, I know somebody who does this. And not only that, but you're just easy to get along with as well. So it's going to amplify that. On your previous podcast that is still up, but you're not really publishing. I'm curious. It's called Who You Needed, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Plus, conscious minimalism is linked in the show notes. I think I forgot my question. Let me go here, though. I'm sure I'll remember it in a second. Going back to this transition, was it scary to pause to not publish episodes on one of them? Or
it was scary. I felt well, here's the thing that I learned from doing that podcast is that I put all my worth into the act of publishing and the act of podcasting. But when your identity is in purpose and in this conscious belief that you are making a difference, it's not necessarily about the action, but about what you're doing to reinforce the identity. So I'm going to go on a little tangent and then I'll go back to my main point. But James Clear has a really great book called Atomic Habits. And I think the key element that people miss is that in order to create the right outcomes, you need to focus on the identity that you want to make. And so for you, Adam, I know that you weren't always the most fit person ever, but you made it your identity to be consistent in the act of working out and to get 6-pack abs, etc. But the 6-pack abs were a byproduct of the identity that you started to form in yourself and putting in the work. And so for me, when I started Who You Needed, I really wanted to find someone that I could look up to. And so I reached out to people that I admired. I had you on the show. I had, different people. But what I discovered is, I just don't want to do interviews for the rest of my life. I actually want to share a lot of these elements and ideas that I've learned and help people find the mental frameworks in order to get out of mental exhaustion, which created conscious minimalism. And it was really scary for me because I didn't produce an episode for maybe 2 years. And then I created conscious minimalism, but it was a lot of hard work and learning and being a therapist and meeting with people one-on-one for years before I created this one.
And actually, that was my question. I was just wondering if you do solos or interviews. So It sounds like the first podcast, Who You Needed, was all interviews.
All interviews, sometimes
but not the first
solos.
ones, right? The first few episodes were you, I think.
The first
I
ones
think I
were me.
remember.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. I've listened to a number of them, and I remember one of them. I think you were like under your covers or something. Like you were like, I'm just doing this, and is that right? Is my memory okay?
You're right.
Yeah, and so then with this new podcast, when I look at it, I'm seeing that it's going out pretty regularly. Like one just came out like 3 days ago. And a week before that, I'm seeing a lot of, 8-minute, 6-minute episodes, 5-minute, 9-minute.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering a couple of things. I don't think that you could interview somebody in that amount of time. We've already been on this call, 3 times that amount of time, and we haven't gotten very far yet. So tell me the strategy when you went to a brand new podcast for the listener. What became the new strategy for your show?
Yeah, so this show really targets remote workers who are in the health and education business. And when you're in remote work, it's really hard to kind of put your work down. And then you don't have like the decency of a commute to like spend 30, 40, 50 minutes listening to someone. So I really wanted to create like bite-sized mental models and mental frameworks to help someone get out of a funk. And so I'm really targeting people that have the luxury of working from home. And usually someone who is working doesn't want to listen to someone for maybe 3-4 hours at a time. They just kind of want something quick and easy so that they can get back to what they want to do. So that's sort of the mental like framework I was looking into when I made that.
I've got a couple thoughts here. Now, when you and I were in the green room, I mentioned a couple of tricks to get a lot of social proof on your podcast, but I have another piece of feedback that I think is going to be beneficial to a listener. So when we're starting a brand new podcast, and you're saying that this is it's targeting remote workers. I think you said in the health and education.
Yeah.
Okay. Remote workers in health and in education. And when I look at the title, it doesn't grab avatar. It doesn't really tell me what I'm going to get. Conscious minimalism is interesting. I would still probably click on it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't like say to the avatar, this show is for you. Like, for example, if it said conscious minimalism, a show for remote workers, or conscious minimalism, how to get this result without this hard thing. And just like speaking to that avatar, maybe on the artwork and as like I either call it a subtitle or a tagline, a subtitle or tagline. So conscious minimalism dash the thing that's going to grab the attention of that exact human, like your perfect listener. I'm hoping that would be helpful to you as well. Just maybe something that can do 2 things. A, it is searchable, like it's the taglines, the keywords that person is looking for already, or B, hopefully both. It's really going to call out the avatar and get them excited, be like, this is for me. Like, she made this show for me. Have to listen. So can boredom be good? I'm going through some of the titles. Can boredom be good? With a question mark. Find out how it can boost your creative flow in 6 minutes. I love that.
Thanks.
I love the title. So to the listener, like when I look at how she's titling these episodes, she's giving a hook, and then she's telling you, getting you real interested in it. And when it's in just 6 minutes or in 4 minutes or, in 3 minutes, whatever it is, 9 minutes, it's like, yeah, I got time to know about if boredom can be good and how it could boost my creative flow, or can procrastination be good? Find out in 4 minutes. It's like, wait, is she going to say that it's good, or is she going to say that it's bad? Like, I always thought I was a bad person for procrastinating, and maybe I'm going to be liberated right here. Maybe I'll feel a little better. So the titles are just very, very good. And I'm going to say one other random thing, because I think it's beneficial to the listener.
Yeah.
When we say things like in today's episode, whether we're vocally saying it welcome back to this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about blah, 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 blah.
Mhm.
There is a subliminal message, like a subconscious message that our listener may or may not hear.
Mhm.
And let's just say, you remember when you were talking, Helen, about how you were having 3 conversations a day, 365 days a year, and
Yep.
maybe you talk to 10 people, you get 0 to 10 of them to
Mhm.
hire you for something, and you're
Mhm.
making money. It's the same thing. It might just be one person out of 10
Mm.
that does the difference, but that is a compounding effect over
Mm.
the course of a month, a day, a year, a decade of having a podcast. And so this small change in today's episode, we do this versus in this episode, we do this.
Mm.
Because when I hear that it's today's episode,
Yep.
my thought is I'm supposed to stop listening to her podcast after I listen to this because this is the one for today.
Yeah.
But if you just say in this episode, you're going to get this, and I go a step further at the end of 6 minutes or at the end of 4 minutes, then I try to promote the next episode. So if you already know what's going to happen, you're like, next episode, we're going to talk about if procrastination could be good. Don't go anywhere. I'll see you on that episode.
Mm.
So then what you get is you're triggering an algorithm in the podcast playing platform
Yeah.
because people are binge listening because they're listening to multiple episodes. So it's subtle.
Yeah.
One way we can do neither thing and people do whatever they want.
Mm.
We can say in today's episode, and a small fraction of them are going to be like, I'm supposed to not keep listening.
Mm.
On the other end, we can say at the end, this was a short episode. I'll see you on the next one. Don't go
Mhm.
anywhere. The next one's
Yeah.
going to be good too. You have
Yeah.
time.
Mhm.
Then they're more likely to keep listening, and then you'll be able to trigger algorithms and really boost your rankings and get more people listening because the podcast playing platform will push you in front of more and more people. I'm loving the titles though. Like, I'm glad we talked about these titles because I really think it's going to benefit the listener. You had some others that were part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, but these last ones just, they really hit you, and it's stuff that I think anybody would be interested in. So it's really good. I've got a question.
Yeah.
In the green room, at least, I don't now remember what you said to the listener or just to me, but you were talking about how the first podcast, who you needed, you didn't have like a clear direction. You were not sure what to do with it, maybe.
Mhm.
And maybe you were tired of doing some interviews as
Yeah.
much. But
Mhm.
this other one has clear direction, and it's targeting remote workers in the health and the education. So what is the next step for your listener? Like, you get that remote worker, they start listening,
Mhm.
and how do you get them to do more than just listen to the podcast?
Yeah, so I have a newsletter that kind of breaks down the 4-minute episodes in a lot more depth. So let's take like the last episode, Can Boredom Be Good? Apparently, like with a lot of creative flow, with a lot of like psychological thinking, especially for remote workers, it's easy to stay busy with like emails and Slack and etc. And so sometimes it's okay to just pause. Like Mayo Clinic just came out with a recent article that says that taking a shower or going on a long walk, going on a workout without any headphones in actually increases your ability to think of things in an innovative, creative solution. Like Albert Einstein would take a walk every single day for 20 to 30 minutes before he went to school and taught lectures at Princeton. And so I take people there to the newsletter, and then they can follow me on Twitter. They can follow me on LinkedIn if they have feedback for me. So it becomes like an ongoing conversation. And then there's also an option to do paid subscriptions for people and like send in your specific questions about getting out of mental exhaustion.
Can you give us an example of the paid subscriptions? I almost said prescriptions.
Prescriptions.
Sounds like a prescription,
Isn't
but
it?
the paid subscriptions.
Yeah. So you go on read.consciousminimalism.com. You can either sign up for free, sign up and pay $8 a month, and then you can send me personal requests, DMs, or you can pay $96 a year for like the full year. But what that does is it allows you to get free access to every single newsletter. With the free newsletter, you get one each week, but then you lose access to it after about a month. Obviously, you get the email, but someone who continues to pay gets the full archive, and then they get full access to me and they can ask me questions. But I make it clear that it's not like mental health therapy. It's just helping you understand in a deeper way what boredom is or what procrastination is. Some people have asked me to write about ambition, like how can you balance simplicity and ambition? And so I do a deep dive for people that are willing to pay for that subscription.
And out of curiosity, Are those topics that will get covered on the podcast as well? Like, or is it just if they're paying?
Yeah. So if they pay, they get like a special shout out on the show too, of like, Adam requested that we talk about like so and so. And so today, this episode is dedicated to Adam. But like, so there's that additional like thing that happens too with the paid subscription.
Okay. Yeah. So this is what it's sounding like to me. If I get the subscription, I now have the ability to ask the question.
Yes.
If I've got a burning question in my heart, if I've got something that I'm hoping to do, hoping to achieve, and I think you were talking about one of them being, well, you've got conscious minimalism, and it's talking about how to like chill, maybe that's my best way to say it. And then you got the ambitious people, and it's like, hey, how do I balance this? Or how do I be ambitious while also being minimalist and conscious about it? And so I'm going to ask a question because I'm torn in my heart, like which way to go, because I want to be ambitious. People say that's an attractive character. And so how do I do both? Because I also like your podcast and your content. So I get that question and I get a shout out. Although if I wasn't subscribed, I'd still get I'd still end up getting the content. It just wouldn't be I wouldn't have been able to ask questions. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's just the episode is a lot more of a summarized like element of the newsletter. So you get like a lot more in-depth breakdown, but people still get like access to the subjects, obviously.
With your conscious minimalism being like, let's just say 4 to 9 minutes, typically 6. How do you go about getting ready for an episode? Do you go on a walk like Albert Einstein for 20 minutes before? Do you study a whole bunch? Do you wing it? Do you just say whatever comes to your head? Like, what is the preparation looking like when I'm intentionally doing short, concise episodes?
That's a great question. I actually have something called an idea factory. So my idea factory is I basically like take an hour a day to consume YouTube content about like writing, copywriting, product engineering. I subscribe to like a bunch of different newsletters that relate to remote work. And I just consume. And then I take copious notes on it on Notion. And then every day at around like 11:30, I go on a 30-minute walk and I get ready to write. And so at 12 p.m. every single day, I get ready to write and I just write down whatever's on my mind. And I have what's called like a daily writing practice. And what that does for me is it allows me to like synthesize all of my ideas, because the beginning of my day is just consumption. And then the middle of my day is just regurgitating the information that I know. And then on Saturday, every single day, I take my notes and I basically write my first draft of the newsletter, like spend some time with my grandma, my mom, my dad, come back that night, like edit. And then the newsletter gets published Sunday morning. Then the video gets made and published on Sunday morning. And so typically all of the final draft and the video gets done on Saturday.
Okay, quick question. Idea Factory, which is an hour to consume and take copious notes on Notion with a 30-minute walk. And then you regurgitate. Is this a 7-day-a-week thing where you consume and then only on Saturday do you ever put a first draft together? Or did I miss something?
Yeah. So the consumption happens every single day. And then the writing of it, it's like it has its skeleton like throughout the week. And then I basically like finalize everything on Saturday. But think of like creating a photo album where I'm just capturing images on my camera every single day. And then I look for patterns. And so the reason why it's called the Idea Factory is it's capturing images and then it's synthesizing like what are the common patterns that I'm seeing people talk to me about on the media? What questions do people have on YouTube? What questions are people putting out in newsletters? And then I basically like take copious notes and I write all of my thoughts down, and then everything gets finalized on a Saturday.
Okay. I've got a couple questions. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to know a couple things here. What did you do for 2 years? You weren't publishing episodes. What did you do in all of that time? And then the second question that I have is if you could go and give yourself feedback or pre-back, what's pre? I don't know if there's a real word. If you could go and preface your first podcast, now that you've done it, you've taken 2 years off and you've started Conscious Minimalism. You've helped a lot of other podcasters, I know. if you could go way back to when you were 19 years old and about to launch that podcast, what feedback would you have given ahead of time so to make it even more successful? We'll be right back. Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, growyourshow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show. We're back with Helen Garcia. Again, remember, she had her first podcast, Who You Needed. She's been on this podcast. She's been on this podcast before, almost 400 episodes. We'll say 370, 380 episodes ago. And the link is down in the show notes, and I want you to check it out. So far, we've talked about her starting her first podcast when she was 19 or 20, how she made money. We talked about the ancillary benefits to being a thought leader, talking to lots of people. We talked about that 10X rule. We'll link to 10X rule, the book as well. We talked about how she was putting her worth into this part, just like when Adam got a six pack. It was really the things that I was doing every day, and the other part was just a result of it. And if you want the right outcomes, you need to make that identity. We talked about solos versus interviews. We talked about who she speaks to. It's remote workers. Even gave her a little bit of thoughts, like maybe even call them out on there to make sure that they're more likely to find you with SEO and things like that. She's talking about how it's easy for them to stay busy. It's okay to pause, shower, or walk. She talked about, I don't remember, was it Einstein or am I misquoting? Okay, Einstein doing that, intentionally taking those breaks. I know that he napped a lot as well, or I've heard that he napped. I wasn't there, so I don't know, but I've heard that he napped a lot. We're talking about how you're also able to start monetizing this podcast as well. You're talking about the newsletter, kind of that goal of having the newsletter, the paid, I almost said it again, subscriptions. I don't know, maybe I need a prescription. That's why it's like Freud is around. And one of my favorite takeaways so far is the idea factory.
Yeah.
An hour sounds like a lot to me. I'm sure for you, Helen, it's just so fun. Like you really appreciate it. You love it. So I'll just say to the listener, if you're going to have your own idea factory in an hour, sounds crazy. If 7 days a week sounds too much, try 15 minutes, 3 days a week, just to start with, and then build up over time. And now we're talking about a couple things. Helen, what did you do for 2 years? And then we'll get into if you could give yourself feedback before you started your first podcast at 19. What did you do for those 2 years?
Yeah, so normal life things. I graduated from grad school. I turned 24, and then something weird happened where I had this like idea that a 24-year-old had to be broke, had to like just have a regular job, had to have a regular 401k. And so I quit all of the podcasting stuff, even though I was like, I had a presence online. I basically deleted everything and I kind of disappeared for a while, as you know, Adam.
Yeah.
We were friends, and then I just stopped interacting with everything. And then I realized that wasn't for me. Traveled a lot. My parents celebrated 28 years of marriage. I was the maid of honor for my mom's like renewal wedding, paid off all my student debt, and then realized that I was losing chunks of my hair. So literally
wait a second. Yeah. When were you losing chunks of hair? It was in this 2 year.
This was last year. I was working for a nonprofit, and I just started losing chunks of hair. I would get out of the shower and it was like gulps of hair just would come off.
I can't imagine that.
It was crazy.
I bet, was that just like crazy scary? Were you like, do I have really cancer or what's wrong with me?
Well,
I did. Are people giving me chemo when I'm asleep?
Are people giving me chemo? I talked to my mom, and because she's a nurse and she works for like with doctors, and she basically told me like, you know, honey, I think you're really stressed out. like that happened to your dad. And my dad was bald. And I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to become like my dad? And so I quit that job. I started working as a private practice therapist. And for people that don't know, when you work in nonprofit as a therapist, you're basically working 70 to 90 hours a week. And then when you work as a private practice therapist, you only see maybe like 20 clients a week. And then the other 20 hours, you're just writing notes or, speaking and doing workshops for different companies. So that's what I ended up doing for the last year.
So you have your own practice now?
I work for a
private. Oh, you work for a private. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing this is because you have a lot of hair. The listener can't see it. You either are wearing a wig or
it's all real.
Is like you're just not as stressed out as you used to be.
Yeah. So my personality came back. So the thing about burnout is that you kind of become a shadow of yourself. You lose sight of what's important. I basically stopped having friends for about 2 years. And then I started getting my sense of humor back. And now I feel a lot more like myself than I did before. So to my friends who hadn't seen me in 2 years, I probably seem like I'm the same person, but I feel like I went through a journey of just figuring out what values are more important to me and what I want to focus on. And that's what created conscious minimalism, where I was like, I'm living with so much mental clutter in my brain that it's literally like breaking my body apart. And I want to get back to who I was before, but better, obviously. So that's what I did. Went on the spiritual trek.
And the next question, I love that. I love that. This is just awesome. And I really hope that the listener goes and follows conscious minimalism. I want to ask you, you've gone through a huge journey about losing your hair, losing your friends, or temporarily being off social and working 90 hours a week and pausing one podcast, maybe because it was too much. And now you've got a new podcast. You feel more like yourself. You're having energy. You're having humor. And if you could go way back, that question that I'm wondering, and just tell yourself some advice prior to maybe launching the very first podcast, who you needed back when you were 19, what would you say?
I would say, be weird, be individual. Like you have something unique that you're giving to the world, and you don't have to look like Joe Rogan or David Goggins to be someone of importance. Like there's only things that only you can do. Number 2, I would tell my younger self not to focus too much on podcasting equipment, because I think that my 19-year-old self was obsessed with just becoming a perfectionist. That in reality, focus more on the type of content, focus on becoming a better writer, focus on asking better questions, and get really good at marketing. Kind of zoom out rather than zoom all in on the podcasting equipment stuff.
Out of curiosity, what does some of this mean? I think we have a few minutes. So you said that you would say, don't worry so much about the equipment. B, focus more on the content and the questions, better questions. And C, focus more on marketing. I want to go deeper into A, what equipment should we be doing? B, the content and questions. What would you say if you were like, well, what do you mean to yourself? What do you mean by that? What better questions? Give me an example of a bad one and a good one. And then finally, marketing. What would you say to your original self on how to be better at, I guess, getting the additional exposure through your show?
Yeah. So with the equipment, I think starting out with just like an SM58 or an MV7 you can't really go wrong with that. Like go for tried and true and don't complicate things. I think I really complicated my process before of let me try a shotgun or let me try a condenser or let me try all of this. And it takes the energy away from the podcast itself because you're focusing more on the tools rather than the big idea. And it's just like when there's a great concept, you can't really go wrong. Even if the equipment is bad, if all you're using is your like Apple earphones, like you'll still capture really good content if people are interested in what they're listening to. So it's not the most important thing, even though it is like part of the reason why people might stay for your content. With marketing, I think that you have to know how to sell yourself.
That's going to be C. Let's go. Let's get some specifics on the content and better questions first on B. Yeah.
Yeah. So for content and better questions, I think when I started Who You Needed, I was that person that just like said whatever was on her mouth. And I just, rattled off different ideas and concepts. And so I would go back and study different story arcs, like read Joseph Campbell's like journey of a story. And like there's a part 1, part 2, part 3. Read books on copywriting, read a lot of great fiction. I think with fiction, like people would be surprised that just talking to people like a 12-year-old would understand is a lot better than using like all of this like mushy gushy words that they teach you to write in high school. Or I think really great writing starts with understanding, like, can a common person down the street understand what I'm doing? If not, then don't publish it and don't complicate the process. So I think both of those are kind of go hand in hand.
And if all of that beautiful, and I hope we can get those books in the show notes as well, so that we can learn how to do that. So hopefully my team was able to pull that, and it's already down there. But as far as like better questions, could you give me an example? Because you talked about better content and studying and giving it to a story and not just off the top of your head, and having like a clear direction of part 1, part 2, part 3. That all makes sense. And I think we can read that book to get even more clarity.
Right.
The part about better questions, can you give me an example of a question that you asked that was not as good, and how you would ask a similar question or a follow-up question now that you've learned it?
Yeah. So when I first started podcasting, I would always ask people like, why did you get into this career? Or why did you choose this? Where I think people have heard that. And so the brain kind of turns off and they kind of just give you the generic, like factory answer. What you want to really do is you want to dig a lot deeper and ask, when you were at that place, what were some of the things that you were thinking about that led you there? Or what would, like, let's say you're 36. What would your 36-year-old self tell your 26-year-old self when you started this business? What lessons do you wish you learned earlier that could have gotten you there faster? I think being able to really take that person to that initial place, to the beginning of the story, where you never want to say like, what are your biggest regrets? Or if you were to start from zero, how would you make money again? I think it gives like a really generic question of like, well, I would just do exactly what I was doing before, but asking people how rather than what gets them to really dissect like, oh, well, how I got there was, I met this guy, which led to this, which led to this. And then also number 3, look at the nonverbal body language of how someone answers the question and dig a little bit deeper of like, you're telling me this was the happiest moment of your life, but your body language changed and your shoulders started to hunch down for listeners that didn't see. Like, what was that about? Like, did that eventually go downhill? And don't be afraid to be candid and just speak your mind of like, you don't really sound convincing right now when you're telling me that was the best moment of your life. Like, is it?
Yeah, that is brilliant. Thank you. I'm glad we went a little bit deeper on those. And then marketing. C, marketing.
Marketing. And so this is a tool that really a lot of mental health professionals are not very good at. And I wish I learned in high school. But marketing is really important because like people need to know what products you're selling, why it's important, and you need to be able to help people understand why they should listen to you. I think when I was in my early 20s, late teens, I just kind of gave things away for free. And that's not a bad thing because it builds a lot of trust, but I wasn't able to tell people why it was important. And with marketing, I think it gives people an opportunity to trust you, and it gives you the ability to like position yourself as this Helen is the only one that can provide me the mental models as a remote worker, versus Helen is just about mental health all the time. And so who you needed was a really general title. It had like a stick drawing of two people hugging each other. It wasn't specific enough to the listener. And so I think if I could go back, I would give myself very specific advice about, okay, who are you serving? Why is it important? What's the takeaway that people should get at the end of it? So similar to the advice that you gave me now.
And I have a follow-up question. So with conscious minimalism, you have products or services that you can serve the listener with.
Right.
And some of those are your newsletter, and some of them are that they can actually reach out and ask questions directly and then get them answered on the podcast. And I'm sure there will be even more. There might already be more. And if not, I'm sure there will be. And I'm curious, you mentioned it, and I'm not quoting you. I didn't write it down exactly, but you basically said people need to know what products you're selling, like what you have. And I'm thinking about this because our listener today most likely is scared shitless to tell their listener that they're selling something, because A, they might get rejected. B, they might think that the person on the other end of their podcast thinks that they're just a sellout. Oh, they're only starting this podcast so they can make money. Like, how off-putting is that, you know? And other reasons. One is I don't know how to do it. I don't know how I would even say it. So I want to kind of ask you, Helen, about conscious minimalism. Like, what are you doing intentionally, consciously, to let your listener know what that next step is, like that they can do those things? And do you feel weird about it? And if somebody is listening and they feel weird about it, what would you share with them? Please, all about calls to action here.
Yeah, with CTAs, it doesn't have to be scary. Like at the end of every newsletter, I put like a long divider headline and I write, when you're ready, here are 3 ways I can keep helping you. And then if you want to go paid, it allows me to answer your questions. It's $8 a month. I also have a burnout course that's like $25 that I put down on my divider. And then during the video, like when I'm publishing on a YouTube video, I kind of put it in the middle of like, you know what, if this 4 minutes isn't enough for you, I do a complete breakdown in my newsletter. You can click the link down below. If you want to go paid, it's $8, but no pressure. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to provide a reason for that. I think a lot of people, when they're trying to sell for the first time, they go, well, it's $8, but you know what? Like, it's really good because you get so, and so, and so. You get this and this and this and this. Well, people can find out about that when they click the link. Just tell them exactly what to do. And, you know, sometimes showing people how you got there is better than telling them what you're selling. So telling people, I created the Conscious Minimalism newsletter because I burnt out and I was losing chunks of my hair, and I don't want you to go through that too. It convinces someone like, oh, I went through that. I kind of want to click the link. I actually got my first paid newsletter subscriber because he felt like he could relate. He actually got cancer working himself to death in the IT industry. And he ended up being my first paid customer because I showed him how I got there, not what I was selling. And yeah, I hope that answers your question, Adam. Actually, that was super, super good. Helen, I'm so inspired by you and impressed with you. Oh, thank you. It's funny. There was somebody that told me I was in good shape for my age. For your age. Pissed me off. You're in good shape in general. Yeah. And so I'm not going to say I'm impressed with you for your age. I'm going to just say I'm impressed with you. And also it's remarkable that you are so young. Thank you. It's pretty cool. Tell them exactly what to do. It was my biggest takeaway here. I loved that. It's like that way they know how to get to that next place. And you don't seem apologetic about it at all. You don't seem like you need to backpedal. You don't seem like you need to prove a point.
It's just, hey, if this isn't enough for you, go check out the newsletter. Like that's the entire breakdown. And then you just keep going. I think it's brilliant. And I think that the listener got massive amounts of takeaways through the whole podcast today. And I'm hoping if they don't yet have a call to action, they're afraid to have a call to action. I think that they've been inspired by how to do it. So that was beautiful.
One quick story I'll say is there's a really old Wall Street Journal article that I read once, and they had this really cool line that I put in my newsletter where they said, if you don't believe us, put our theories to the test and subscribe for $40 a year and see if it works. If you don't like it, you can just not subscribe again. And so people can test your theories or like thoughts on podcasting or thoughts on minimalism if they pay for your service. But if they don't like your service, they just don't have to pay. It's like anything else in the world. Like if you don't like a gas station, you don't have to pay for that gas station ever again.
Yeah. Love it. All right. I've said this call to action to our listener many times. The Conscious Minimalism podcast link is in the show notes. Go and check it out. Listen to the show, especially if you are a remote worker. And if you got a friend who is, and I know you do, just send it to them so they can check it out. Give her a rating and review. Let her know what you think about it. And looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. Don't go anywhere. I'll see you there.
This is serious. Don't go. Now that you've gotten whatever value that you feel that you got, the actionable takeaways, you need to implement the stuff that you learn. If you remember me talking about bird church once, and they learn how to fly, and then they walk home, I don't want you to walk home. I want you to fly home. So take the steps, take the actionable steps for your benefit so that you can become a better podcaster. That's the only thing that I ask of you. And I'll see you for more actionable tips on the very next episode.